June 1940. A French road somewhere in the chaos of defeat. A German column advances through a river of refugees. And then, something impossible. A young French girl steps forward and allows herself to be embraced by the enemy. This is amateur film, shot in the middle of the Battle of France, never shown to the public. Discovered decades later in private collections on both sides of the Rhine. There are other sequences equally disturbing. German soldiers and French civilians fraternizing in occupied barracks in full occupation. Images of soldiers and civilians smiling at each other, seeming to genuinely like one another. To see these films, the occupation of France by Germany would appear light, even sweet. But what do these private films, these forbidden images, really tell us about the occupation? What meaning should we give them? Seemingly harmless, these films show us another face of war. A face we've spent 70 years trying to forget. The people who filmed these moments are still alive, or were when these images were first rediscovered. We can ask them directly what they felt, what they saw, what they chose to remember, and what they chose to film. One French woman, filmed as a young girl during the occupation, admits, "I wasn't in awe in front of the Germans, but I wasn't against them either." A German soldier, decades later, reflects on his time in France. "I can return anywhere in France or Belgium. Nowhere did I leave bad impressions." These new images take us into the privacy of families. Jews wearing the yellow star in Paris, filming their newborn baby as if the Germans weren't there. A German soldier who joins the French resistance, living two lives. I was of course aware to live two lives, one as a brave soldier and the other as a fighter against fascism. What did German soldiers feel under their helmets? How did the French perceive them at the time? And how did they react when correction turned to brutality, when smiles turned to executions, when neighbours became enemies again? 70 years later, thanks to these private images and the testimony of those who filmed them, we return to a painful period of history under the crossed gaze of French and Germans. This is the story of the enemy next door, the most intimate occupation in modern history, and what it revealed about survival, collaboration, resistance, and the impossible choices ordinary people faced when the hereditary enemy moved in and refused to leave. Her name is Janelle, this young girl filmed in the winter of 1939-40. 22 years old. The beautiful age. How could she imagine that a few months later, in June 1940, she would end up on that road, in the fear of being caught by the hereditary enemy, the Boche? Decades later, she remembers, "We didn't know them, except through the stories told from the war before, the abominable stories that they cut off boys' arms. It was excruciating. We had this fear. We were running away, and at the same time, this escape dishonoured us in a way." You have to understand that in the war of 1914, there was no family who had not had a death or a wounded soldier. This wasn't abstract history, this was living memory. Another survivor recalls, "All my uncles had one arm or a foot less, so I was raised in this spirit of war, and I said to myself, in my head, the Germans were killing everyone." The Germans, the barbarians, the enemy who had torn through their parents' generation just 26 years earlier. These weren't just stories from school books. These were stories told at dinner tables, whispered in bedrooms, carved into the bodies of uncles and fathers who came back from the trenches maimed and broken. Every French family carried the scars of 1914. Physical scars. Psychological scars. A generation traumatized by industrial slaughter on a scale humanity had never seen. And now, just over 2 decades later, the sons of those German soldiers were coming back. The fear was visceral, generational, passed down like an inheritance. Janelle and millions like her fled south in the Great Exodus of June 1940, 8 million people on the roads, the largest movement of refugees in European history up to that point. They fled with whatever they could carry. Baby carriages, wheelbarrows, horse carts piled high with mattresses and cooking pots. And all the while, they wondered, what will the Germans do when they catch us? Among them, Warrant Officer Günther Flamm, 20 years old. Young, proud, soaked in Nazi propaganda. He remembers the advance through France. I have to tell you, we looked more in front of us than to the right and to the left. We paid attention that no one attack us from the side. They were moving fast, faster than any army in history. The Blitzkrieg in action. Tanks, mechanized infantry, Stukas screaming overhead. The French countryside blurred past. Villages, churches, fields of wheat. Of course, sometimes we said to ourselves, too bad, it's a beautiful church and it is destroyed, but it was war. There's something chilling in that casualness. The way he dismisses the destruction with a shrug. It was war. What can you do? Proud. Absolutely convinced of their righteousness. We were very proud, it's true, but not exuberant. We gave it our all. For us, it was a question of survival after France and Great Britain declared war on us. Notice how he frames it. Not Germany invading Poland. Not Hitler's aggression. But France and Britain declaring war on Germany. A question of survival. This is what Nazi propaganda had accomplished. These young men genuinely believed they were the victims. That Germany had been forced into war. That the French were the aggressors. From the battlefield, another German soldier, Hans-Georg Schultz, writes to his parents back home. His letter captures the mindset perfectly. It's a real horror for the people of this region. But why did the French want war? The Führer tried everything to avoid it. Now they will have a funny surprise. They have already admitted our superiority. A real horror for the people. He can see that. He's not blind to the suffering. But in the same breath, he blames the victims. Why did the French want war? They're getting what they deserve. A funny surprise. This is the moral gymnastics of the occupier. Sympathy and cruelty existing side by side. In perfect order, the Germans enter villages like Colonges in the south of the Jura. This amateur film was taken in secret from a skylight, an act punishable by death. The cameraman's name is Victor Barbe. He's a customs officer who had worked in the Saarland in 1935 and brought back photos and films of the new Nazi Germany. He had seen the rallies, the book burnings, the systematic persecution of Jews, the militarization of German society. Here is the first meeting of Hitler in Saarbrücken that Victor filmed. A distressing climate. He knows what's coming. He knows the Nazi ideology in ways most French don't yet comprehend. In the first days of the occupation, Victor Barbet is the only one to realize the nature of the Nazi danger. For him, this is not just another occupation. Not like the Prussians in 1870. This is something far more dangerous. Something ideological. Something that won't be satisfied with military victory alone. But his neighbor, Suzanne Malaga, doesn't see it that way. Not yet. For her, and millions of other French civilians, the first contact with the enemy is about to challenge everything they've been taught to believe. The first Germans reveal themselves quickly as ordinary soldiers. Suzanne Malaga remembers, "The officers were very arrogant. I had contact with an officer. There was no need to say too much. But the soldiers by themselves were friendly and polite." This distinction matters. The officers, arrogant, distant, embodying the Prussian military tradition. But the common soldiers, friendly, polite, almost apologetic. They almost knew all French words, so they managed well enough to speak. Afterwards, being polite, they greeted politely. They replied. Can you imagine the shock? You've spent your entire life hearing about German barbarians, about atrocities in Belgium, about children with severed hands. And then the Germans arrive, and they say, bonjour, politely. They tip their hats. They buy bread and pay for it. They show you pictures of their wives and children. And then, the critical moment, the realization that changes everything. We expected to see barbarians, and in reality, we had men like us in front of us. Men like us. That simple phrase contains the entire tragedy of occupation. Because once you see the enemy as human, as men like us, everything becomes infinitely more complicated. Another French civilian describes the shock of first contact. The first Germans we have around me, I trembled. I said, what is he going to do to me? She's waiting for violence, for rape, for the barbarity she's been promised. And he didn't do anything to me at all, in fact. The story of a mistake, or perhaps the beginning of a trap. Reassured by the behavior of the hereditary enemy, the French do not see, or don't want to see, the arrival of Nazism in France. Ostensibly, the Germans are correct, sometimes even respectful. This is shown in amateur film shot by Edwin von Rothkirch, a general from the German military aristocracy. He films himself with his own son in Verdun, on the very places where he fought almost 25 years earlier during the First World War. Think about that for a moment. This German general is bringing his son to the battlefield, where he killed French soldiers a generation ago. And now he's back, victorious. But watch what he does. Germans bowing in front of French monuments, paying respects at the graves of French soldiers from the Great War, standing at attention, removing their caps. Should we really fear these Germans who honor French war dead? These men who seem to understand the cost of war? These soldiers who treat French monuments with reverence? It's a performance. Of course, it's a performance. But it's an effective performance. because it plays on French notions of military honor, on the idea that soldiers, even enemy soldiers, share a bond, that they understand each other in ways civilians never can. And for many French people in those early weeks, it works. They allow themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, this occupation won't be so bad after all. Among the captured soldiers, many French admit the superiority of the German army. One prisoner tries to articulate the shame, the humiliation, the shame of being a prisoner, because we are here to fight, not to be stripped of our weapons and witness the success, the victory of the enemy. If in addition you are captured, they put you in camps. I was there to fight, not to escape. Nearly 2 million French soldiers were taken prisoner in the Battle of France. 2 million. In 6 weeks. It was the largest mass surrender in French military history. Larger than Sedan in 1870. Larger than anything the French army had experienced. And the shame of it ate at these men. They had been raised on stories of French military glory. Napoleon. The poilus of Verdun who had held the line. They shall not pass. But they had passed. In 6 weeks, the Germans had accomplished what they couldn't do in 4 years during the First World War. Another prisoner adds, "When I saw them, the way it was organized and ordered, I said to myself that we were no match. We were coming out of a difficult period. It was the phony war. What did we do during this war? The officers, like the others, we played a lot of bridge. The phony war. September 1939 to May 1940. 8 months when France and Germany were technically at war, but nothing happened. The French army sat behind the Maginot Line playing cards. The officers drank wine. The men wrote letters home. Everyone waited. And while they waited, the Germans trained. They planned. They rehearsed their invasion down to the smallest detail. The contrast couldn't be sharper. French officers playing cards while German soldiers trained for total war. A German soldier reflects on this difference. We were politically pumped up to go to war, while the French were not. That's my impression. They were fighting. They said to each other, "We are soldiers, we must fight," but they didn't really believe it. And he's right. The French didn't believe it. Most French soldiers in 1940 had no idea why they were fighting. To defend Poland? A country most of them couldn't find on a map. To stop Hitler? But hadn't France already tried to stop Germany in 1914 and lost nearly an entire generation? There was no fire in their bellies. No ideological conviction. Just a grim sense of duty and the hope that somehow this war would end without too much bloodshed. The Germans had something the French didn't: belief. Whether that belief was justified or monstrous is beside the point. They believed, and belief in war counts for a great deal. General von Rothkirch's film continues with a terrible scene that seems to announce the racism at the heart of the Nazi project. He films starving black prisoners who fight for meat. A goat is going to be skinned and eaten raw. The camera lingers on their desperation, on their hunger, on their struggle, as if the Germans wanted to demonstrate the superiority of their race. As if they wanted to say, "Look at these people. Are these the defenders of European civilization?" Everyone films them. Multiple German soldiers with their personal cameras, capturing the same degrading scene from different angles. Adding between sequences ironic comments. The great nation in the camps of prisoners of Belfort. They are the fighters of European culture, as the soldiers write in their photo albums. Among these amateur photographers is Klaus Kendler, 20 years old. He remembers his shock at encountering colonial troops. "I entered France, and for the first time I saw so many people of colour. In Germany there were none. In Berlin there was only one soldier of the colonial troops from the First World War, and he lived in Zendorf. He was the only man of colour." This is what Nazi Germany had accomplished. A racially homogeneous society where an entire generation of young Germans had never encountered people of colour, never spoken to them, never seen them as fully human. So, when Kendler encounters black and North African soldiers in French prisoner camps, they're not individuals to him. They're curiosities. Exotic specimens. Proof of French decadence. But then something unexpected happens. Kendler tries to talk to them. "I asked the prisoners, especially blacks and Moroccans, 'Why are you here?' They jumped when they heard French spoken. They were making desperate gestures, showing us that they had no idea why they had to make war on us. They had no idea." Most of these colonial soldiers had been conscripted from French territories in Africa, shipped to Europe, given rifles, told to fight. Many didn't speak French fluently. Most had no understanding of European politics. They certainly didn't care about the balance of power or the fate of Poland. They were there because France owned their countries. Because the colonial system could extract not just resources, but bodies. Cannon fodder for Europe's wars. The German soldiers film them with contempt. But there's another layer to this footage, the way it reveals France's own racial hierarchies. The way colonial soldiers were used and discarded. The way they suffered disproportionately in captivity. Both sides, German and French, were guilty of racism. The Germans, more overtly, more ideologically, but the French too, in their colonial system, in the way they treated these soldiers. And caught in the middle were men who never wanted to be there in the first place. This is a special release from the Führer's headquarters. Paris has been declared an open city. June 14th, 1940. The Germans enter Paris without firing a shot. The French government has fled south to Bordeaux. The French military has declared Paris indefensible. To save the city from destruction, it will not be defended. They paraded singing down the Champs, Élysée. A young Frenchman, Roger Tellier, 14 years old, films the disaster in Orléans. He's stunned and, like many French people, intrigued, even troubled by German power. They still gave the image of great discipline, so that was very impressive, and then the fact that they were arriving gradually to dominate Europe. So that meant they had organizational qualities of command, of strategy, that we didn't have. Imagine being 14 years old and watching this. Your country collapsing around you. Your father's generation, the men who won the Great War, defeated in 6 weeks. And the Germans marching through your city, looking like they're on holiday. Smiling. Taking photographs. Singing their victory songs. And then the admission that hurts most. There was necessarily a feeling of admiration while disapproving. We could only say to ourselves, we don't know if the French would have been capable of that. Admiration for the enemy, mixed with shame at his own people's failure. One French witness watching the parade remembers, "We felt like they were crushing us. I'll tell you something. I won't tell you that we had a certain admiration, but we were watching that. We saw our troops before. They happened to parade. Of course, it was still very impressive. If you like, it was like, in quotes, at the cinema to see these people. There wasn't a button missing, not a hair sticking out, and who were parading there. Like at the cinema." That's the perfect description of what many French people experienced in those early days. A sense of unreality. Of watching something that couldn't possibly be happening. Just weeks ago, France was a great power. One of the victors of the First World War. A nation with the largest army in Europe. Protected by the supposedly impregnable Maginot Line. And now German soldiers were taking selfies in front of the Eiffel Tower. Faced with the German triumph, France is experiencing one of the most serious identity crises in its history. Here in Orléans, with the statue of Joan of Arc looking down. The symbol of French resistance. The peasant girl who saved France from English invasion in the 15th century. Even where a year earlier, the French army marched in front of the President of the Republic in celebration of Bastille Day. More than a defeat, a collapse. A collapse of French power, French prestige, French self-conception. With incalculable consequences. They are beautiful, tanned, relaxed. On their private films, the winners who settled in the summer of 1940 are disarmingly youthful and carefree. For them, the war is over. France has surrendered. Britain will surely sue for peace. They'll all be home by Christmas. They conquered France in 6 weeks. A miracle. What took 4 years of grinding attrition in the Great War, they accomplished in a month and a half. And it is as tourists that they discover their hereditary enemy. Hans Heysel is just 18 years old when he arrives in Paris, assigned to the naval headquarters at Place de la Concorde. I only had wonderful feelings, because for the first time in my life, I was in Paris, and I discovered this magnificent city. Listen to the wonder in his voice. The genuine awe. This isn't a conquering soldier gloating over victory. This is a working-class kid from industrial Germany seeing Paris for the first time. I come from Leverkusen, from a family of workers, and the biggest city that I knew until then was Cologne. I had never been further. I could only dream of Paris. It was a wonderful feeling to feel this city, to discover it. Under other circumstances, Hans Heysel would never have visited Paris. A working-class German in 1940 couldn't afford international travel. Couldn't take vacations to foreign capitals. But war makes strange things possible. It gives a factory worker's son from Leverkusen the chance to live in Paris, to walk the same streets as Hemingway and Picasso, to eat in French cafes and visit the Louvre. All he has to do is wear the uniform of the occupier. While visiting Paris on June 28, 1940, just after the armistice, Hitler himself gave the signal for how France should be treated. He spent 3 hours touring the city. The Opera, the Madeleine, the Arc de Triomphe, Napoleon's tomb. Hitler admired French culture. He genuinely appreciated French architecture, French art, French history. But he considered the French people themselves decadent, weak, corrupted by democracy and racial mixing. France, in Hitler's vision, would no longer play any political role in Europe. It would be reduced to a cultural showcase, a museum, a vacation destination for Germans. The new Europe, under German domination, would preserve French monuments, French cuisine, French wine. But the French themselves would have no say in their own governance, no voice in their own future. Following Hitler's lead, German soldiers are encouraged to discover Paris, to visit the museums, to appreciate the architecture, to enjoy this city that the French do not deserve, and which, Hitler believes, will be reborn upon contact with superior German culture. A capital emptied of its men, reduced to its charms, objectified, feminized, fantasized. Watch the German amateur films filmed in the first weeks of occupation. The French woman was a sort of sex symbol. French men? They never talked about them. France, Paris, these are the women. Where are the French men in these films? In prisoner camps in Germany, fled to the unoccupied zone, hiding, ashamed. Paris becomes a city of women, children, and old men, and young German soldiers with cameras. Hans Heisel remembers an encounter that captures the strangeness of this period perfectly. One day, I wanted to go to the opera, and I was in front of the opera, quite sheepish. They were giving Faust, the only opera that the French have managed to write, by Charles Gounod. Notice that little jab. The only opera the French have managed to write. German cultural superiority asserted casually, almost unconsciously. Someone must have noticed that I was so sheepish, and a French couple arrived. They took me under their wing, and I was able to listen to Faust in the second row. Think about what's happening here. A French couple sees an enemy soldier, a German in uniform, looking lost outside the opera. And their instinct is to help him, to take him under their wing, to share their culture with him. Are they collaborators? Cowards? Or just decent people trying to maintain some semblance of civilization in impossible circumstances? Maybe all three. Maybe none. Maybe those categories don't mean anything in the moral chaos of occupation. Despite clandestine opposition from a minority of French people, notably the Gaullists who fled to London, the first months of the occupation take place without any real clashes. Most French people accommodate German domination. Not happily, not enthusiastically, but they accommodate it. Like this young woman, Renée Penin, filmed at Buttes Chaumont Park in Paris. It always seemed to me that the Germans were very correct, that they had orders to be correct with the population of the country they occupied. Correct. That word appears again and again in French testimony from this period. The Germans were correct. polite, proper. It's a very French word, correct? It means more than just polite. It means behaving according to the rules, following proper form, maintaining social conventions even in abnormal circumstances. I finally said to myself, we have been beaten, we are occupied. It's fair game, if I dare say so. They are there, they are victorious, they beat us very clearly. Too bad for us. Fair game. Listen to how she's framing this. Not as an injustice, not as an invasion, but as the natural consequence of military defeat. We lost, they won, fair game. I wasn't looking to find out more. It was for us, finally, to do what we could to reduce the disadvantages of this occupation. This is the psychology of accommodation in a nutshell. Don't ask too many questions. Don't dig too deep. Just try to get through this with as little suffering as possible. From this early atmosphere, many traces remain, difficult to interpret, uncomfortable to contemplate. Especially these beautiful photos of soldier Bolts in Normandy. His son, Rudolf Bolts, remembers looking through his father's photos decades later. There, it's my father in the park, I do not know where. For them, the war was over. Photos his father sent back to Germany to reassure his family that he was safe. That France was pleasant. That he was being treated well. It was very good. My father could walk everywhere by car on the coast. He spent a lot of time with the inhabitants, as seen in photos. This is in a restaurant again, something like that. Me too today. If I were on vacation and I was served well, I will take a photo like that to remember how nice it was. On vacation. That's how Rudolf sees his father's time in France. Not as an occupier, not as a soldier enforcing Nazi control, but as a tourist on vacation. There, we see the stores full of products despite the war. At home in Germany, it wasn't as full, and there in France you could buy everything. My father was very proud to have the invoices of everything he bought in these stores. So proud he kept the receipts. Souvenirs of his shopping trips in occupied France. While back home in Germany, stores were running short on basic goods. Rudolf, looking at these photos as a child, drew his own conclusions. We see that this has not always been as terrible as what they say, from my point of view. Because there, everyone is at peace, together, and this is how we behave with the population. We don't see anywhere someone unhappy. It emanates a feeling of peace. At 10 years old, we don't think any further. At 10 years old, we don't think any further. But we should. Because these photos, as benign as they appear, are deeply misleading. Yes, the stores are full. But they're full because Germans can buy whatever they want at artificially favourable exchange rates while French people go hungry. Yes, everyone in the photos looks peaceful. But of course they do. You smile for the camera when an occupying soldier points it at you. What else are you going to do? Yes, his father looks like he's on vacation. But he's on vacation in a conquered country, living off the forced labour and economic exploitation of the French people. An idealised vision that would almost make you forget that the occupation is exercised by force, by armed soldiers, by the implicit threat of violence against anyone who resists. Listen to what most French people say. who at the beginning of 1941 still can't imagine what the Nazi regime has in store for them. We tolerate them, then you get used to it. Then, if you have one who lived with you, at the beginning when he passed, he walked through the rooms, he greeted you, that was how he did it. Then we invited him to coffee. We invited him to coffee. Think about that progression. First, you tolerate the enemy soldier billeted in your home because you have no choice. Then you get used to him. Then, somehow, you're inviting him to coffee. How does that happen? How do you go from enemy to guest? He was almost part of family is a big word, and he could, if he spoke a little French, explain to us that he had his wife, his children there, that he would like to see them again. They showed us pictures of their children. They were very nice to us. They showed us pictures of their children. Suddenly, the enemy has a face. A family. A wife waiting back home. Children who miss their father. It's impossible to hate someone who shows you pictures of their children. That's the genius and the horror of this German strategy, whether calculated or accidental. Another French civilian remembers the Germans billeted in their town. There was one who was an artist. I remember he painted. There was another who was a musician. The one who was an artist, he painted paintings. We often saw him, sometimes on the banks of the Rhone or in the forest. They painted pictures. They were doing their little quiet work. They didn't bother us. They didn't bother us. That phrase keeps appearing. The Germans didn't bother us. They were polite. They were correct. They did their little quiet work. It's almost as if the French are trying to convince themselves, trying to make sense of the cognitive dissonance of living with the enemy. From the German side, the perspective is remarkably similar. One soldier reflects, "We couldn't expect that they love us. We were the enemy, but I never had any problem with a French civilian. Maybe I was lucky, but I never had any problems. I behaved normally. They respected me, and I respected them. I behaved normally. They respected me, and I respected them." There's something deeply unsettling about this mutual politeness. This veneer of civility, maintained even as France is being systematically exploited, plundered, and controlled. Another German soldier adds, "In the German army, there were surely Germans who weren't happy to be there. It's always the same. They were men, like any other. I am sure that they weren't all, they didn't care about anything. Men like any other." That phrase again. The same phrase French civilians used. We expected barbarians, but we found men like us. This is the trap of occupation. The moment you recognize the humanity of the occupier, resistance becomes infinitely more complicated. Until 1942, the SS are hardly present in most of France. The death squads, the Gestapo, the true believers, they're focused elsewhere. On the Eastern Front, on rounding up Jews in Poland, on the grand ideological project of the Thousand-Year Reich. Facing the French in these early years are simple, regular army soldiers, the Wehrmacht, conscripts, men who were bakers and teachers and factory workers before the war. A German soldier describes how they tried to navigate this impossible situation. "We tried to apologize by telling the French that we were not there of our own free will. We were here following orders." Just following orders. That phrase will become infamous after the war. But in 1940, 1941, it's not yet a cliché. It's just what these soldiers tell themselves and the French to make their daily interactions bearable. They understood it perfectly, because often brothers or fathers were in Germany as prisoners. The first farmer where we were staying had one of his sons prisoner on a farm in Germany, and he wrote, "I'm fine." And therefore, the exchanges with our host were positive, at least correct, and even very pleasant afterwards. Very pleasant. A German soldier occupying France describes his relationship with the French farmer, whose son is a prisoner in Germany, as very pleasant. This is the absurdity of occupation distilled to its essence. Both men are prisoners of a system neither fully controls. The French farmer can't free his son. The German soldier can't leave his post. So they make small talk. They're pleasant to each other. An unreal climate. Unimaginable for our memory reconstructed by history, textbooks, and resistance narratives. To see these private photos and films, the occupation is indeed sweet. But underneath the smiles and the coffee and the paintings of the Rhone, something else is happening. France is being slowly strangled. The young Heinzheit lives in the Oise, in contact with the young people of the village. He builds a friendship with a young girl named Viviane. He remembers her fondly decades later. The only thing that interested her was being able to dance. It was great to hold this graceful little being in my arms. She wanted to dance. In the middle of occupation, in the middle of war, in the middle of national humiliation, this French girl just wants to dance. And this German soldier is happy to dance with her. It was friendship, a way to have a good time, that's all. And I would say that we arrived there perfectly. Between the girl and the soldier, the relationship remains platonic. He insists on this point. It was friendship. Nothing more. It will survive the war through letters they exchange, continuing until 1947, the date on which Viviane gets married to a Frenchman and disappears from Heinz's life forever. What did Viviane think about this friendship? We don't know. She never gave her testimony. We only have Heinz's version, the German soldier's memory of the graceful French girl who liked to dance. Did her family know? Did her neighbors talk? Did she face consequences after the liberation for her letters to a German soldier? The silence is telling. Surprising stories, but not so rare. The seduction of the Germans, or perhaps the seduction by the Germans, seems to be lasting on a significant part of the French population. As shown in this movie shot by a German soldier, even French artists and intellectuals frequent the occupant. Here, the writer Jean Cocteau at a gathering with plainclothes German officers. Cocteau, toasting with the Germans. Laughing. Making conversation. What harm in toasting with them, he seems to be telling us through the camera. They appreciate French culture. They're educated men. We can talk about art and literature and music. But they're also the occupiers. The representatives of a regime that will, within a year, begin deporting French Jews to their deaths. German seduction affects even children who are too young to understand the politics of occupation. Listen, 70 years later, to what these little girls on bikes remember. I have a memory of the Germans, but it was the high level. They had horses, They had great black boots. They were as beautiful as anything. Quote, as beautiful as anything. A little French girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, watching German cavalry officers and thinking they're beautiful. The tall boots. The horses. The uniforms. Another girl adds, I was in awe in front of the Germans. They had extraordinary costumes, those who were next to us, and then they walked with their horses. For us it was magnificent, and they played with us a little. They played with us. German soldiers playing with French children. Perhaps tossing a ball. Perhaps letting the children pet the horses. Small kindnesses that cost nothing but by goodwill. But then, the contradiction, the adult world breaking in. But in the family, the Germans, it was the devil, it was the enemy. You shouldn't play with them, there was no need to stay with them. The children are caught between two realities. What their eyes tell them, kind soldiers with horses who play with them. And what their parents tell them, these are the enemy, the devil, don't go near them. Which reality do you believe? The evidence of your senses or the warnings of your elders? For many children, the answer was clear. They believed what they saw. And what they saw was that the Germans were often nice to them. This is one of the occupation's most insidious effects. It normalized the abnormal. It made children think that living under foreign military control was just how life worked. One German soldier remembers an amusing incident that captures the strange intimacy of occupation. The villa we were in had a roof terrace, and the weather was nice. In the afternoon, I stripped for sunbathing. He's sunbathing naked on a French rooftop. The casual privilege of the occupier. 3 days later, I passed in front of 2 young women in the street, and one of them said to me, "We saw your entire body." And I asked them, "What do you mean?" They said, "We looked at you with binoculars from up there." I told them, "You had fun." You had fun. There's something almost flirtatious in this exchange. The German soldier is amused rather than embarrassed. The French girls are bold enough to admit they were watching. In normal times, this would just be a cute anecdote about young people flirting. But these aren't normal times. One of these people is occupying the country of the others. The French girls remember the period differently, with more ambivalence, more awareness of the dangers. We were pretty because we had nice to have nothing, but we talked. Girls, watch out. Girls, watch out. There's a whole conversation packed into those 3 words. A warning. An acknowledgement that looking pretty around German soldiers was dangerous. That certain things could happen. We had taken down the double curtains to make dresses. We didn't have a gram extra. It was 45, 46 kilos. We had short skirts with petticoats, obviously. They're trying to look nice with literally nothing. Curtains turned into dresses. Barely weighing 100 pounds. Short skirts, because there's no fabric for long ones. There were girls. They were naughty because I don't say that they enticed them, but they seemed to say, "You see the beautiful toast there, under one's nose. Nothing, you see? You see the beautiful toast there, nothing." What a perfect metaphor. The French girls are the toast, appetizing, desirable. The German soldiers are hungry. And some girls, whether from mischief or desperation or genuine attraction, are putting themselves right under the soldiers' noses. I didn't do it because I was too scared. Too scared. Of what? Of the Germans? Of her neighbours? Of being labelled a collaborator? Of all of it? Before finishing with German seduction, watch this latest movie. It was shot by this soldier in a leather coat, Otto Messerschmitt. In what year did he live in France? We do not know. The film has no date. No context. The only certainty is that he passed through Belgium, then through Paris. And this woman he calls Esmelda in his notes is his mistress. The camera shows them together, laughing, walking arm in arm, looking at each other the way lovers do. You forever, he writes on the film canister. An intimate moment captured on 8mm film. A timeless scene. As if they were any two lovers in Paris. As if war didn't exist. Come on, let's go to bed, the intertitle says. Obviously a love story, as there have been thousands during the occupation. Who would deny it? People fall in love. Even during war. Even across enemy lines. But what happened to Esmelda after the liberation? Did she have her head shaved in the public square like thousands of other women accused of horizontal collaboration? Did neighbours spit on her? Did they parade her through the streets? Otto kept the film. A souvenir of his time in Paris. His French lover. His romantic adventure. But for Esmelda, if that was even her real name, this film might represent something very different. Evidence. Proof of collaboration. A death sentence to her reputation, if not her life. We'll never know. She's lost to history. Just another face in another German soldier's home movie. For us, however, looking at these films 70 years later, the question is valid. These private images shot by the Germans, although authentic, are they not misleading? Let's put ourselves in the shoes of these shopkeepers, these farmers, these ordinary French people. How can you not smile at soldiers who smile at you and film you? What are you going to do? Scowl at the camera? Refuse to sell them bread? They have the guns. They have the power. They control your country. So you smile. You're polite. You act as normal as possible. For the French, the German correction is a trap. A carefully constructed facade that hides the brutal reality of occupation. Other films shed light on the true Nazi intentions. Here, in the Loiret, a Frenchman films a bronze statue being carried away, soon to be melted down and transformed into a German cannon. There, in Belgium, a church bell suffers the same fate. Bells that rang for centuries, that called villagers to worship, that marked births and deaths and marriages, torn down and shipped to Germany. There are also all these bikes requisitioned. Thousands upon thousands of bicycles confiscated from French civilians. Little things, maybe. A statue. A bell. A bicycle. But watch this movie, we see a country given over to systematic pillage. Robert Marot, 17 years old, from a family of industrialists in the town of Troyes, is not fooled by the German correction. There was German propaganda who told us, the Germans are nice, the German soldiers will help you. There were posters who showed us a German who stroked a child's head, who gave him a bottle. There was propaganda. The posters were everywhere. German soldiers helping French civilians. German soldiers playing with French children. German soldiers rebuilding France. The German soldier is good, polite, the soldier pays for what he buys. Robert pauses, then adds with bitter irony, yes, it's with our money. With our money. This is the economic reality of occupation that most French people are only beginning to understand. Since the armistice of June 1940, France pays 400 million francs every day to Nazi Germany. Every single day. 400 million francs. In today's money, that's roughly 20 million euros per day. Over 7 billion euros per year. For 4 years. This money, extracted from French taxes, French businesses, French banks, pays for the German occupation of France. The French are literally funding their own subjugation. And because Germany controls the exchange rate, German soldiers can buy French goods at roughly 1/3 their actual value. A meal that costs a French worker 3 days' wages costs a German soldier less than a day's pay. So yes, the German soldier pays for what he buys. With French money. At artificially low prices. While French civilians go without. An extremely heavy price for a defeated nation. As these pictures from Customs Officer Victor Barbet show, France is cut in two between the occupied zone and the so-called free zone in the south. The demarcation line, la ligne de démarcation, runs across the middle of France like a scar. It separates families. It prevents trade. It ruins businesses. You need a special permit, an Ausweis, to cross from one zone to another. The Germans control who gets these permits. They can grant them or deny them on a whim. Farmers in the south can't sell their crops in the north. Families are split with no way to visit each other. The French economy, already devastated by military defeat, is now being systematically dismantled. The Germans are correct, maybe. They smile. They're polite. They pay for their purchases. But it's all a way to put the French to sleep. To make them forget the systematic sacking of their country. To make them forget the 1.5 million French prisoners of war still detained in camps across Germany. Difficult, 70 years later, to imagine the impossible choices facing ordinary French people. To keep their jobs and feed their families, many accept contact with the occupant. They don't have a choice. Robert Marot's family, the industrialists, are in a particularly delicate position. For us, we had to live. The factory had to run with the staff. As it was a dye house, we worked in dyeing, and we made verdigris. We worked for the Germans. We worked for the Germans. There it is, the admission that haunts so many French people after the war. We worked for the Germans. We helped them. We collaborated. Not just for the Germans, but the Germans gave us work anyway, so as to dress their troops, and we were the biggest factory. Notice how he justifies it. Not just for the Germans, we also made dyes for French customers. But yes, also for German troops. Because we were the biggest factory. Because they came to us. It was running, but the small factories of our competitors, they did not turn, they were not allowed to tour, we couldn't do what we wanted. So they had a monopoly. The Germans shut down the competition and forced all dye production through the Marot factory, where they could control it, where they could ensure it served German military needs first. If we were filming, it was because the Germans wanted us to film. They wanted us to shoot because we could work for them. Even the act of filming required German permission. Nothing was free. Nothing was innocent. You don't want to work for us. No coal, or none of this, or none of that, and then it's over. The choice was simple. Work for the Germans, or close the factory. Close the factory, and everyone loses their jobs. Everyone starves. What would you do? But there is much worse than economic collaboration. From 1940, Hitler annexes Alsace-Lorraine in total violation of the Armistice Agreement. These French provinces are simply declared German territory, as if the armistice never said otherwise, as if France has no say. As seen in this amateur film, the Nazis erase all traces of French history from Alsace-Lorraine. French street signs are torn down. French language schools are closed. Speaking French in public becomes an act of resistance. The Nazis conscript Alsatian teenagers into the Hitler Youth. Boys as young as 14 are put in uniforms, taught Nazi ideology, trained for war. They will send many of them to the Russian front within a year or two. French boys forced to fight for Germany against the Soviet Union. The malgré nous, against our will, as they'll be called after the war. Tens of thousands of Alsatian men will be conscripted into the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS. Forced to wear German uniforms. Forced to fight for the regime occupying their homeland. And if they refuse? Their families are deported. Sent to camps. Disappeared. There is also this repression, more and more severe, which affects the entire occupied zone. Arrests. Raids. Executions of hostages. From 1941, any dispute of the German presence, any act of resistance, no matter how small, is punished in blood. One Parisian remembers a terrifying encounter. So, we leave the cinema. A German car arrives with officers. They make us put along the wall, hands on head. Just walking out of a movie theatre. Grabbed without warning. Lined up against a wall. So, we put our hands on our heads, and my father understood. He said to me, "That's it, we're good. We're going to be shot." His father knows immediately what's happening. This is a reprisal. Someone killed a German officer. Now they're rounding up random French civilians to execute in retaliation. We stayed half an hour, and another car of soldiers arrived, who said in German, "You can release them, we have the count." And we were released. They have the count. Somewhere else in Paris, 20 other French civilians weren't so lucky. They had the count. 20 hostages for one dead German officer. The quota is filled. It was a raid. There had been a German officer killed in the neighborhood, so they took 20 hostages to shoot. 20 for 1. That was the official German policy. For every German killed by the resistance, 20 French civilians would be executed. Later, the ratio would rise to 50 for 1. Then, 100 for 1. Another Parisian witness describes the daily horror. I have to tell you, my parents' apartment overlooked the fort of Romainville, and every morning at 5 a.m., we could hear the machine gun who was shooting the guys who were sentenced to death. Every morning at 5 a.m. Imagine waking up to the sound of executions. Every single morning. The machine gun fire echoing across the city. Every morning, I asked my father, "What is that?" He would say, 5 o'clock, that's it, it's still apart, guys arrested yesterday. Still apart. More guys arrested yesterday. More executions today. And tomorrow? And the day after. This is the reality beneath the smiles and the coffee and the graceful French girls who wanted to dance. This is what German correction really means. All in all, decent Germans, even benevolent sometimes. But not with everyone. Dirty Yid, it's always the dirty Yid. To put us back in the incredible anti-Semitic climate of the time, we are watching a rare film, that of the Boyer family, a French Jewish family who is hiding in Paris in full occupation. In this apartment, a small daughter has just been born. Her name is Martine. She's French. Born in Paris. But she's also Jewish. And in 1941, that means she can be arrested at any time. Her entire family can be arrested, deported, killed. Her parents, who were able to save a small camera when they went into hiding, make an extraordinary decision. They decide to film her arrival. To pretend that the Germans are not there. To create a record of normal family life. To act as if their daughter has a future. They disguise themselves and register Martine with her sister at the civil registry office. Without yellow stars. Pretending to be Christian. Her birth is announced in newspapers and on the radio. They have a party, inviting uncles and aunts who are also in hiding, also living under false names. Everyone smiles for the camera. Everyone pretends this is a normal birth celebration. Everyone pretends their lives aren't in constant danger. To ward off fate. To refuse to accept what's coming. To hope, against all evidence, that they might survive Nazism. For Hitler, France must be purged of its impure elements, the Jews. From the spring of 1941, soon seconded enthusiastically by the Vichy regime, Germans begin to arrest Jews and deport them eastward. The first targets are foreign Jews, like the Raudis and the Sidlikis, who arrived from Poland in the 1930s fleeing persecution there, only to find persecution following them to France. Here is Leon Sidlicki, 10 years old at the time, in this amateur footage with his aunt carrying her daughter, both wearing the yellow star. Looking at the old film decades later, Leon remembers, "This is my aunt and me. We leave the house. In fact, there we are in a haven of peace, solitude. It's very preserved. Preserved. Present. Preserved. That word is critical. Because in this secret alley in the east of Paris, in full occupation, Leon Sidlicki is protected. Protected by a couple, Mr. and Mrs. Jacob. French Protestants who, like many other French people in those years, start to realize the horror of what's happening and decide they must do something. Decades later, Léon reflects on his survival. I am a miracle thanks to Mr. and Mrs. Jacob, which, unfortunately, are no longer there. Mr. Jacob did what his heart told him to do. I wouldn't say it's duty because it's a big word, but he had a heart. People had to be saved, and he did it. He had a heart. In a time when having a heart, when acting on basic human decency, could get you killed, Mr. Jacob sheltered a Jewish child. Everyone knew we were Jewish, but there was no problem. Even afterwards, next to Villa Godin, they even came to warn us that there would be problems. The neighbours knew. Of course they knew. You can't hide a child in a small Parisian neighbourhood without people noticing. But they didn't say anything. They kept the secret. Some even warned the Jacobs when they heard rumours of raids. This is the other France. The France that doesn't appear in German home movies. The France of quiet resistance. Of people who risked everything to save strangers. For me, the people I met throughout this period, the French, were fantastic. But then Léon asks the question that still haunts him. It's always hard to imagine how we were able to bring human beings to the slaughterhouse. Remember that the Germans were one of the first nations from an educational point of view at the time. Musical, literary, educated people, sensitive. They glorify themselves still today of that. Germany, the land of Goethe and Beethoven. Of Kant and Schiller. Of Bach and Brahms. One of the most cultured, most educated, most philosophically sophisticated nations on earth. And yet, you see, the human being changed suddenly because they were promised bread and highways. Bread and highways. That's what it took. Economic recovery. National pride. The promise of greatness restored. And an entire nation of educated, cultured people was willing to overlook what was being done to the Jews. Or worse, to participate in it. Spring 1943. 3 years already since the Germans occupied France. In a river north of Paris, teenagers bathe as if nothing is happening, filming each other with an amateur camera. Among them, Guy Trinquet. 17 years old at the time. We wanted to do something. We wanted to be active, to try to participate anyway to our future liberation, and then that's all. Nobody suspects it. Not even his girlfriend. Not the other teenagers splashing in the water. Guy Trinquet is a member of a resistance network fighting against the occupier. The only feeling we had, it's that they're leaving, and let us do everything for that. That's all. It came down to this. They're leaving. After 3 years of occupation, after 3 years of German correction and politeness and smiles, a critical shift is happening in French consciousness. The Germans are going to lose. It's no longer a question of if, only when. Forget the first correction of the Germans. Forget the smiles that disarmed. Forget the politeness, the respect at French war memorials, the soldiers showing pictures of their children. With the control of the SS intensifying in France in 1942, with the invasion of the so-called Free Zone in the south, with the escalating persecutions, a gap is widening between occupiers and occupied. An unbridgeable gap. Guy remembers the constant vigilance. I knew I had to be careful. I took the metro, and I didn't put myself where they could open the door quickly. Someone opens the door, and they push you out. He's talking about German tactics for dealing with suspected resistors. Push them out of a moving metro train. Make it look like an accident. No paperwork. No trial. Just another Parisian who fell to his death. This is daily life for a 17-year-old in the resistance. Every metro ride could be your last. Every street corner could hide a Gestapo agent. Every friendly German soldier might be gathering intelligence. With private films and photos discovered in attics and private collections, we continue our story of the years of occupation under the crossed gaze of French and Germans. But the gaze is no longer curious or even hostile. It's the gaze of people who know their enemies, who are simply waiting for this to end. Paris remains a spectacle for German soldiers. But the spectacle has changed. Since Germany's attack on the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, France has become a rear base for Wehrmacht soldiers. A zone of calm where exhausted, traumatized soldiers are sent to rest before being thrown back into the meat grinder of the Eastern Front. One German soldier remembers, "When we returned from Russia, we were sent to St. Brieuc. We wanted to restructure ourselves before leaving." Restructure. That's the euphemism they use. What they mean is recover from the horror of the Eastern Front. Try to forget what we saw. Try to stop the nightmares. Try to become human again before they send us back. And the new soldiers said, "When are we leaving?" I told them, "Be pretty happy we're here. I would have ended the war here. I would have ended the war here." Think about what that means. This German soldier would rather spend the rest of the war occupying France, despised by the locals, living as an unwelcome guest, than return to Russia for one more day. That's how bad the Eastern Front is. France, even occupied France, with its growing resistance, even France where German soldiers are increasingly hated, is paradise compared to Russia. German soldiers continue to film France as if they're on vacation. But if you look closely at the footage from 1943, you can see the difference. The soldiers look older, harder. There are fewer smiles, more thousand-yard stares. These are men who've seen things. Without realizing it, the Germans are filming their own defeat. It's there in their faces, in their exhaustion, in the way they flinch at loud noises. And the French perspective is shifting dramatically. There were too many. We saw them everywhere, all these soldiers in boots, which paraded constantly. What was impressive in 1940, the discipline, the order, the endless columns of German troops, is now oppressive. Suffocating. The French are sick of German boots on French streets. One day, I cut off a convoy and I found myself on the sidewalk. It bothered them to see that we weren't nice. If they greeted us, we didn't answer. We didn't answer. This is the new resistance. Not armed resistance, not yet for most people. But the resistance of silence. The resistance of turned backs. The resistance of refusing to smile anymore. It's as if we don't see them. You are there, stay there. Do what you want. We can't see you. We do our little thing. We go, we come. You're not there. You're not there. The French have learned to make the Germans invisible, to look through them, to act as if the occupation isn't happening even while it crushes them. Another French witness remembers the change in German behavior. As soon as they returned somewhere, it was the Nazi salute. They were entering the store and they asked for things. But in a way, but badly. They weren't nice. They could have had a little more softness to buy what they wanted. The correction is breaking down. The mask is slipping. German soldiers are no longer bothering to be polite. They're demanding, not asking. Taking, not buying. They didn't like us anyway. They didn't like to laugh. But one French woman offers a different perspective. The French have behaviours full of delicacy. When we were on the subway and one of them passed in front of us, he said, "Sorry," and walked politely through the door. At our place in Germany, it was not customary. Me, personally, in France, I sometimes thought that we behaved like rednecks. Wait. That's a German soldier speaking. A German soldier who feels ashamed of how his comrades are treating French civilians. Who notices French politeness and German rudeness. Even among the occupiers, there are those who see what's happening. Who recognize the deterioration. Who understand that the war is turning against them and the occupation is becoming unsustainable. The German standard of living in France remains high. The winners continue to benefit from an exchange rate favourable to the Reichsmark. Everywhere, they serve themselves first. One German soldier recalls without apparent shame. In fact, there was still plenty to eat in Brittany, in local restaurants where we had a good drink. Once, we sang the Internationale, but instead, we said, "People, eat more bananas, and you will stay healthy." They're making jokes. Singing communist songs with the lyrics changed to mock songs about food. Laughing about how much they have to eat while the French starve. Jokes that no longer make anyone laugh. As shown in a film shot in secret by the Le Bihan family in Normandy, more and more French people do not eat their fill. The camera captures what German home movies never show, the reality of French daily life under occupation. The systematic looting by Germany is now visible to everyone who has eyes to see. There was nothing in stores, or almost. There was nothing anywhere. They received very little. There was no food, no clothes. We didn't have any shoes. There was no meat. There were no poultry. There was nothing. We were starving. We were starving. Not hungry. Not making do with less. Starving. They brought in half a pig in the charcuterie for the week. It was the Germans who took everything. They left very little. It was necessary to feed the Germans first. Feed the Germans first. That was official policy. Germans eat. Then French people get whatever's left, which is usually not much. One French woman describes a moment of hunger so profound it still shames her 70 years later. One day, I was coming down from work, and as I was always very hungry, I saw two Germans in front of me on the sidewalk who were eating a soldier's cake, and I followed them. She followed them, watching them eat, hoping for what? A dropped crumb? Eating was an obsession, and one of the two soldiers threw the cake on the ground. He threw it on the ground. Maybe it fell. Maybe he was done with it. Maybe he dropped it deliberately, knowing she was watching. And what did I do according to you? I picked it up and felt ashamed. If you knew how ashamed I was, I still think about it. I still think about it. 70 years later, this woman, elderly now, probably in her 80s or 90s when she gave this testimony, still remembers the shame of picking up food from the ground behind German soldiers. Because I said to myself, if anyone sees me doing this, you see? So I removed the teeth part and I ate my cake. She removed the teeth part. The part where the German soldier had bitten, and ate the rest. You still have to be hungry to do this. You still have to be hungry. This is what German correction really means by 1943. French people picking up scraps behind German soldiers. And the Germans filming themselves, enjoying full meals in restaurants. With their cameras, Germans enjoy filming these dependency situations. Like here, Captain K of the 23rd Infantry Regiment, filming French civilians clearly desperate for food, for help, for anything the Germans might provide. The camera becomes a weapon, a way to assert dominance, a way to document French humiliation. In France, during the occupation, several dozen thousand women maintain connections with the occupant. The exact number is impossible to know. Estimates range from 30,000 to 80,000. Maybe more. For many, it's a means of survival. One French woman explained simply, "I was in distress, but there were not many men. They were old people. The young people had gone to war. There were a lot of prisoners. A lot. In our family, there were 7 or 8 prisoners. All our men were prisoners. All our men were prisoners." Think about what that means for a moment. An entire generation of French men gone. Some killed in the Battle of France, but most taken prisoner and shipped to camps in Germany. 1.5 million French prisoners of war. 1.5 million. Out of a total French male population of roughly 20 million. That means, in many French families, there were no men between the ages of 18 and 50. No fathers. No brothers. No husbands. No boyfriends. Just women, children, and old men. And German soldiers. "There is no problem," she says, with a kind of defensive resignation. The terrace of the Meurice Hotel, headquarters of the German command in Paris. This is where Heinz Lorenz works, on the left in this film. This officer is responsible for organizing soldiers' leisure activities. He lives happy years in Paris. His standard of living is enviable. He is being filmed with his French mistresses. Plural. Not one mistress, but several, appearing in different scenes in his home movies. It's easy, indeed, for this father from a Berlin family to play protector in times of unrest. One French woman describes the exchange coldly. Women with children to feed, who no longer had a husband. He was a prisoner, who didn't have a job, had to have money. A pass, or little touches. Help, support in difficult times. Money. a pass to cross the demarcation line, extra food rations, protection from arrest, help getting a job. These are the currencies of occupation, and German soldiers control all of them. We don't necessarily prostitute ourselves, but we take advantage of the masters of the day. The masters of the day. Another woman, recorded on film speaking with remarkable candor, says, "Me, I am a little flower that knew many misfortunes, but I know now how to cope. Men are so stupid, they fall like weather vanes, and me, I know how to catch them. I know how to catch them." There's a certain pride in her voice. A refusal to be ashamed. Yes, she's using German soldiers. But they're using her too. And in her calculus, she's getting the better end of the deal. But for most French people, these connections are unacceptable. A betrayal. Collaboration in its most intimate form. That's what this girl thinks. Geneviève Christophe, filmed in 1943 while she plays in an amateur theatrical production. Asked decades later what people thought of women who had relationships with Germans, she doesn't mince words. People thought that they were prostitutes. I can't say it any other way. And then more. Get close to the enemy like this. You must not love your country. They were traitors. Prostitutes. Traitors. They still benefited. Good supplies. We had nothing to wear, but these ladies wore new clothes. The visible signs of collaboration. New dresses, when everyone else is wearing curtains, cut into skirts. Stockings when everyone else's legs are bare. Meat on the table when everyone else subsists on rutabagas. I knew a person who lived on Rue Gambetta, along the railway. She saw people return with the packages carried by German orderlies. People who put themselves with the Germans because they lacked everything. Can we throw stones at them when we are in the context? Can we throw stones at them when we are in the context? That's the impossible question. Judged from the comfort of peacetime 70 years later, is less than Hajan, zero hash, is greater than, or try to understand the desperation that drove women into the arms of the enemy. Another French woman offers a different perspective, more pragmatic and perhaps more honest. Once the guy is naked in his bed, he's a man, period. It's not marked on his card that he is Boche, he doesn't have a swastika. He's a man, period. In the dark, in bed, the uniform is off. The occupation is temporarily forgotten. He's just a man. She's just a woman. And maybe, just maybe, there's genuine affection there. Maybe even love. Or maybe that's just what people tell themselves to make it bearable. At the same time, in a prison camp in Austria, Oflag 70A. These images are unique. They were taken without the knowledge of German guards, using a hidden camera sent by clandestine parcel from France. We see the vanquished of 1940 wasting their time, getting depressed, going around in circles. Between religious processions and entertainment for prisoners. This is what happened to the French men. While their wives and girlfriends navigate impossible choices back home, the men rot in camps. For 4 years. 5 years for some. The boredom is crushing. The sense of uselessness is overwhelming. They pace. They organize lectures. They put on plays. Anything to pass the time. But especially in this amateur film, there's an incredible sequence. Preparations for escape unfold before our eyes. To end the humiliation, 100 officers dig a tunnel under the barbed wire. It takes months. The dirt has to be hidden. The work has to be done in absolute silence. The guards can't suspect. Among the escapees is Jean-Quen Grenadier. He explains their motivation. We were losing beautiful years of youth because politicians of the Third Republic had not been able to lead France to success. Then there was the call of General de Gaulle, who was an incentive to follow his example. We didn't escape to go for a walk. I would like to emphasize this point. We all made the commitment to take up arms against the enemy. That is to say, not going for a walk, to go to Vienna and live the high life. It was precisely to resume the fight against the German. To resume the fight. These officers could have sat out the war in relative safety. Bored, yes. Frustrated, certainly. But alive. Fed. Out of the fighting. Instead, they risked death to escape. Not to go home. Not to see their families. But to resume fighting. Some will make it to North Africa and join the Free French forces. Some will be recaptured and shot. Some will die in the attempt. But they try anyway. Because sitting in a prison camp while France suffers is unbearable. Because honor demands it. Because the politicians failed, but they don't have to. On November 11th, 1943, one of the turning points in the history of the German occupation takes place. In Oyonnax, in the Aisne region, a few dozen resistance fighters arrive by surprise in front of the Germans and parade to the war memorial to pay homage to their elders from the Great War. November 11th. Armistice Day. The anniversary of France's victory in the First World War. A day the Germans have forbidden the French to celebrate. And these resistance fighters, these maquis, they parade anyway. In broad daylight. In full view of the German garrison. Armed. In formation. Like a real army. A resident, Raymond Rouleau, accompanied by his son Pierre, films from his window this symbol of rebirth. The camera shakes with excitement or fear or both. What made the most impression? This is the order, discipline, and the perfection of the organization of this day. We felt the beginnings of a small army. The beginnings of a small army. For 3 years, the resistance has been shadowy figures. Anonymous saboteurs. Faceless voices on BBC Radio London. People who disappeared in the night. But here in Oyonnax, they show themselves. They march in formation. They lay a wreath at the monument. They sing the Marseillaise. And then they disappear back into the forests before the Germans can react. They were ordered by soldiers who seemed to be respected, and it all worked so well that we suddenly had the idea that the Maquis was not a vague troop of people who lived in the woods, but there was a secret organization which existed and on which we could count. We could count on them. That's what changes. The resistance is no longer just an idea. It's a reality. An army in the making. A force that can challenge German control. It was a reaction to the propaganda who was not missing an opportunity to discredit all the actions of the resistance, presented as terrorists who only loved to steal money. Be smart. Terrorists, bandits, common criminals. That's how German propaganda portrays the resistance. But the people of Oyonnax saw the truth. These were soldiers, French soldiers, fighting to liberate their country. For the Germans, France, by signing the armistice, renounced all military action. The war between France and Germany is over. Therefore, those who resume the fight are not soldiers. They are not French. They are terrorists. As shown in this amateur film filmed in Brittany, partisans were not in uniform. Neither in Russia nor Yugoslavia. They could hide and appear out of nowhere at any time. One German soldier explains his fear. We weren't afraid of the Americans, but resistance fighters. Yes. Think about that. More afraid of French civilians with stolen rifles than of the most powerful military in the world. Why? Because the Americans fight according to rules. They wear uniforms. They identify themselves. You know where they are. But the resistance? They could be anyone. The farmer selling you eggs. The young woman serving you coffee. The old man sweeping the street. The word Maquis comes from bush, is it not? We weren't afraid of the Americans, but resistance fighters, yes. Another German explains the official position. I do not accept the idea of being partisan. They are waging a war that is not recognized by any country. For me, and according to the Geneva Convention, they are not soldiers. So these are not the laws of war applied to them. When we shoot, we shoot. In other words, they will be wiped out. When we shoot, we shoot. They will be wiped out. This is the German legal justification for massacres, for executing prisoners, for burning villages, for killing civilians. They're not soldiers, therefore we can do whatever we want to them. The Geneva Convention, designed to protect combatants and civilians in war, becomes a weapon. Because the resistance doesn't meet the technical definition of a uniformed military, they have no protection, no rights, no mercy. Some Germans, however, transgress the ban. Like Hans Heisel, who is now 23 years old and is always stationed at the naval headquarters in Paris. Remember Hans? The 18-year-old working-class boy from Leverkusen who arrived in Paris in 1940 with wonderful feelings, who was taken under the wing of a French couple at the opera. 3 years of occupation have changed him. Through meetings, especially with an opponent of German politics, he realizes the criminal madness of Nazism. He was a social democrat, but from the left, and whose brothers had been arrested by the Gestapo in Wuppertal. A German political refugee. Someone who fled the Nazi regime and ended up in Paris. And now the Nazis have followed him here. He told me what the Nazis had done in his city. They had tortured one of his brothers, and another had been sent to a concentration camp. Hans had no idea. Like most Germans, he'd been fed a steady diet of propaganda. He knew the Jews were being sent away, but told himself they were being resettled. He knew political opponents were arrested, but assumed they were criminals. It was very new to me. I had no idea about any of this then, and in my process of awareness, this led me to think, why am I here? What role do I objectively play in this war? Why am I here? What role do I play? Those are the most dangerous questions a soldier can ask. Because once you start questioning, you can't stop. After several months of reflection, Hans Heisel makes a decision that could get him executed. He joins the French Communist Party clandestinely while remaining at his post at German naval headquarters. And he agrees to provide weapons which will be used to fight his compatriots and kill some of them. Let that sink in. A German soldier at his desk in German military headquarters is stealing weapons and giving them to French communists who will use those weapons to kill German soldiers. I was completely opposed to taking a gun and killing a German. I was completely opposed to that. And those are the communists who did this. He draws a line. He'll help the resistance. He'll steal weapons. He'll pass information. But he won't pull the trigger himself. It's not resistance at all on my side, if I dare say so. It was no use. It's very cowardly. He calls himself a coward. But then listen to his reasoning. As soon as a German was shot down, they took hostages. They were shot. It was no use at all. He's not wrong. Every German soldier killed led to 20, 50, sometimes 100 French civilians executed in reprisal. Was it worth it? The real resistance, it's doing everything you can on your side, each to your own extent, and it went all the way to the Maquis. So, there was armed resistance. At that time, we were fighting. It was a real war. It was normal. But Hans's contribution was different. Information. Resources. Documents. Weapons. All stolen from under the noses of his superiors. I thought it was necessary to release the German people from these criminals. That was the reason. To release the German people from these criminals. I had such a position that if I had done nothing while knowing that they were major criminals, I couldn't have looked at myself in the mirror. They do not represent my homeland. On the contrary, they are criminals who have defiled the name of Germany in the world. A German soldier fighting against Germany. Not because he hates Germany, but because he loves it. Because he believes the Nazis have stolen his country. And the only way to get it back is to help them lose the war. How do you react to Nazi Germany? As these 1943 films show, two minorities commit themselves, one by resisting, the other by collaborating. To imitate Germany in order to raise France. Behind the militia leader Joseph Darnand, hero of the First World War and future Waffen-SS officer, individuals go astray. Like the one who films this ceremony in Savoie, André Gimmel, an amateur cinema enthusiast. He writes in his diary, "The figures of militiamen are severe and harsh. The martyrs of National Socialism make up its strength and its greatness. Their doctrine will defeat their formidable enemies. Jews, communists, the kings of the black market. The martyrs of National Socialism." A Frenchman writing about National Socialism as if it's a French movement. As if Hitler's ideology belongs to France. These are men who look at Germany, Nazi Germany, totalitarian Germany, genocidal Germany, and think we should be more like them. The militia, la milice, becomes the French Gestapo. Frenchmen hunting Frenchmen. Frenchmen torturing Frenchmen. Frenchmen betraying Jews to the Germans. Frenchmen executing resistance fighters in the woods. Some do it for ideology. True believers in fascism, in authoritarian order, in racial purity. Some do it for power. The militia gives them authority they never had before. Guns. The ability to arrest people, to confiscate property, to play at being important. And some do it for revenge. Against the communists who threatened them before the war. Against the Jews they blame for France's problems. Against the resistance fighters who make them feel like cowards. Whatever their reasons, the militia will be remembered as traitors. After the liberation, militia members will be hunted down with particular vengeance. Because the French can almost forgive collaboration with Germans. But collaboration by Frenchmen against Frenchmen, that's unforgivable. Between these two minorities, resistors and collaborators, most French people remain quartered, entangled in their contradictions. An example, still in Savoie. The Ferret family films Marshal Pétain. The man who made the choice of collaboration. Who signed the armistice? Who shook Hitler's hand at Montoire? Who puts his police at the service of persecuting Jews and repressing resistance fighters? For many French people, in particular the young Gabriel Ferret, 15 years old at the time, Pétain is the only one who can resist the Germans. He was a bit like Joan of Arc in my little girl imagery. I could assimilate him to Joan of Arc, to all those who sacrificed themselves for France. Probably he would save us, but I didn't really know how. Like Joan of Arc. The hero of Verdun. The saviour of France in 1916. The old marshal who told the French to stop fighting because more bloodshed was pointless. To young Gabriel, Pétain is protecting France from within, playing a double game, appearing to collaborate while secretly undermining the Germans. This is the myth many French people tell themselves. Pétain is the shield. De Gaulle is the sword. One protects France from inside. One fights from outside. Together they'll save France. It's a comforting lie. The Germans were our enemies. We weren't wrong. These were the hereditary enemies. They had killed my uncle, hurt others. Yes, they were our enemies. So even while following Pétain, even while accepting the armistice, Gabriel knows the Germans are enemies. The cognitive dissonance is extraordinary. It wasn't the Germans who were going to teach us. No, it wasn't the Germans. It was the national surge. We used to say that at the time. The national surge, le sursaut national. France would regenerate itself, become disciplined, moral, strong, not because the Germans told them to, but through their own will. This is the psychology of Vichy France. We're not collaborating with the enemy. We're rebuilding France. The fact that this rebuilding happens to align with German interests is just a coincidence. Indifferent or abused by the reassuring image of Marshal Pétain, most French people do not realize the extent of Nazi persecutions. They see what they want to see. They believe what they need to believe. Because the alternative, that France's hero is collaborating in genocide, is too horrible to contemplate. In Pithiviers, in the Loiret. This family, the Imbolts, films life without too much worry about the fate of Jews who are imprisoned in a camp at the exit of the city. They filmed the place themselves in 1940, while it was still a barracks for French army soldiers. Here, at this location, thousands of Jews will be imprisoned, especially women and children, arrested during the Vel de Hiv roundup, before being deported to Auschwitz. The Velodrome de Hiva roundup. July 16th and 17th, 1942. French police, under orders from the Vichy government, arrest over 13,000 Jews in Paris. Not Germans. French police. They're taken to the Winter Velodrome, a sports stadium, and held there for days in horrific conditions. No food. No water. No toilets. In the middle of summer. Then they're transported to camps like Pithiviers, and from there to Auschwitz. But the Imbolts don't know this, or they don't want to know. One family member remembers, "We didn't even know what was happening in the Jewish camp, at the camp where there were the Jews. We were in the center. So, did we have a protected life? I don't know, but in our neighborhood, we didn't realize what was happening. We didn't realize." The camp is at the edge of town, visible from certain streets. The trains arrive. The trains depart. People see the guards. They hear things. But they don't realize. Or they don't want to. The Jews arrived at Pithiviers station were taken directly in convoy to the camp. They were not mistreated. They were taken in a procession, in a row. And then, at the beginning, we brought them, escorted by French gendarmes, to do commissions in town. Escorted by French gendarmes. This is the critical detail. The Jews are being guarded by French police, not Germans. They're allowed to shop in town. They're walking through the streets like ordinary people. For the population, to see people accompanied in town by the French gendarmerie, it could only reassure, so a lot of people didn't ask any questions. It could only reassure. If the treatment was really bad, the French police wouldn't participate. Right? If this was really about death camps, the French government wouldn't cooperate. Right? These are the lies people tell themselves. The assumptions that allow them to go about their daily lives while their neighbors are being rounded up for extermination. One family member recalls asking her mother about it years later. "Once I asked the question to my mother, 'What did you know about the camp?' She was embarrassed because she didn't really know how to answer me." She was embarrassed. The only thing she told me, it's that from time to time, when they came to do their commissions, there were some who threw pellets or who filed papers with addresses, and my parents followed the notes. That's all. Thanks for watching. Secret notes. Pellets of paper. Addresses. Pleas for help. The Jews were trying to communicate with the outside world. Trying to tell people what was happening. Trying to get messages to family members. And some French people, like this woman's parents, picked up the notes and followed through. Small acts of humanity. Small acts that probably saved no one but mattered anyway. But I think they were fooled, deceived by the presence of French gendarmes. That is sure and certain. Fooled by the presence of French gendarmes. The Vichy government's collaboration made the Holocaust possible in France. Not just possible, easier. Because if the French government was participating, it couldn't be that bad. Could it? And then, years later, the weight of that ignorance. I felt very guilty, to have missed out, to have lived a life relatively quiet, and then this enormous injustice. It's horrible because when I learned what had happened, the arrests of Jews, all the things I didn't know, that we could start such a machine to destroy man to man. I had a certain idea of humanity, but then I said to myself, the sentence trails off. Because how do you finish that thought? What do you say when you realize that humanity is capable of mechanized murder on an industrial scale? That your neighbors were complicit? That you yourself did nothing? How to judge the attitude of the French 70 years later? Collaborator? Resistor? What do those enigmatic smiles in the photographs really mean? In La Rochelle, we meet Robert Brochot, a photographer. His store is requisitioned by the Germans to develop the photos of soldiers. This is a good example of the impossible position many French people found themselves in. We collaborated, must take things as they are. We collaborated, everyone collaborated, the baker collaborated, the pastry chef collaborated. We accepted them as customers. I do not speak as that German army. They were considered like customers. Like customers. They come into the shop. They hand over their film. They pay. Robert develops the photos. They pick them up. Like any other customer. Except these customers carry guns. Except if Robert refuses service, they can close his shop. Arrest him. Deport him. We talked afterwards when we spoke better German. We asked where they came from, where they were from. Over time, Robert learns German. He talks with the soldiers. He learns their names. Where they're from. Whether they have families. One of his clients, his name is Friedrich. We were the exact same age. We were 20 years old, 21 years old, and he was from Frankfurt am Main, and he came to the house. He came to the house. Not just to the shop. To Robert's home. They became friends. We closed the door on the road, and behind every evening at 8 p.m. for 3 months he was there. We listened to London, the French talk, to the French. They listened to London together. The BBC. The free French broadcasts from London. General de Gaulle's speeches. News that contradicted German propaganda. Listening to these broadcasts was illegal. Punishable by prison. Possibly death. And Friedrich, a German soldier, was listening with him. He listened to this thing for more than 3 months. He had his own idea, but not Hitler's idea, being a simple German citizen, as they are now. Not Hitler's idea. Another German soldier who didn't believe. Who saw through the propaganda. Who wanted the war to end. Who maybe even wanted Germany to lose so that the nightmare would be over. But here's what makes Robert Brochot truly remarkable. In the secrecy of his laboratory, while developing German military photographs, Robert makes a decision. He duplicates the photos. 700 photos to testify later. Photos of atrocities. Military secrets. Troop movements. Equipment. Commanders. Everything that passes through his darkroom, he copies. A huge risk, punishable by firing squad. If the Germans discover what he's doing, they'll execute him immediately. No trial. No appeal. They'll stand him against a wall and shoot him. But he does it anyway. For 3 years. 700 photographs. So, is Robert a collaborator? He develops German military photos. He's friendly with German soldiers. One comes to his house every evening. Or is he a resistor? He secretly copies incriminating evidence. He preserves proof of German crimes. He listens to illegal BBC broadcasts. The answer is both. And neither. Because the categories don't work. Because life under occupation is too complex for simple labels. Another example in the Jura with Victor Barbe, the customs officer, the one who filmed the arrival of Germans in 1940 from his skylight, risking death. He is now their translator, a sort of intermediary with the inhabitants. With his wife, he frequents the Germans socially, especially soldier Bauer, whom he will continue to see after the war. They exchange Christmas cards. They write letters. They remain friends. But that doesn't stop Victor from filming an anti-German scene, despite the ban. That day, strangers threw nails in the road to puncture the Germans' tires. And the inhabitants are requisitioned to remove them. The session turns into fun. Victor's camera captures it. The French remove the nails, slowly, inefficiently. And then they put them back in the center of the road. The Germans don't notice. Or they pretend not to notice. Or maybe some of them are in on the joke. A ballet of resistance and absurdity that ends with a parody of a military inspection. A fake German officer reviewing an army of sweepers, their brooms at attention like rifles. Everyone is laughing. French civilians. Maybe even some of the German soldiers. It's ridiculous. It's dangerous. It's a tiny act of defiance, disguised as comedy. And what was it, above all, being French under the occupation? We put up with the Germans, and at the same time, we resist them, without even realizing the contradiction, a kind of doublethink of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia. You smile at the German soldier who comes into your shop. You wish him good morning. You ask about his family. And then after he leaves, you copy his photographs and hide them away as evidence. You translate for the Germans. You help them communicate with French civilians. You're friendly with them. And then you film them being mocked, film French civilians sabotaging German vehicles. You attend Marshal Pétain's rallies. You believe he's saving France. And you listen to de Gaulle on BBC radio at night. You work in the factory that makes uniforms for Germans. Because you have to eat. Because your workers have to eat. And you slip messages to the resistance about German troop movements. This is the reality of occupation. Not collaboration or resistance, but both at once. A constant navigation between survival and dignity, between complicity and defiance. And if that makes you uncomfortable, if you want clearer categories, clearer heroes and villains, good. It should make you uncomfortable, because that discomfort is the beginning of understanding. Almost 4 years of war. For the Germans, the happiness of being in France is nothing more than an old memory. Goebbels on German radio: I ask you, do you want total war? The crowd in Berlin roars, yes. But the soldiers in France are less enthusiastic. From Brittany, Klaus Kendler writes to his parents in Berlin: I'm starting to get tired of it. I've seen so many already. My best years are passing away. I'm fed up with France. Except Paris, the most terrible. We don't see the end of it. Fed up with France. Remember Klaus? The 20-year-old in 1940 who filmed black prisoners with curiosity and contempt. Who photographed Paris like a tourist. 4 years later, he's tired. Exhausted. He wants to go home. In 4 days, I will be 22 years old. I cannot believe it. Last year, I was in Russia. Now I am in France. And next year, where will I be? Where will I be? He doesn't say, when will I be home? He says, where will I be? Because home is no longer a certainty. Survival is no longer a given. I was taking years. The end of the war was not in sight, and it was clear that this would not end well. It was clear this would not end well. Another German soldier reflects: there had been Stalingrad and after North Africa, and we told ourselves that it would end by a disaster. Those who still really thought to be able to win the war were fantasists. Fantasists. Stalingrad. February 1943. An entire German army surrounded and destroyed. Nearly 300,000 men killed or captured. North Africa. May 1943. Another German army surrenders. 250,000 more prisoners. Sicily falls. Italy switches sides. The Red Army pushes west. Allied bombers pound German cities night after night. By 1944, every German soldier knows the war is lost. They're just trying to survive until the end. One French woman receives a huge bouquet of flowers at her job. She doesn't know who sent them. When leaving work, not knowing who had sent the flowers, she notices something. I have a German in uniform following me and the sound of boots behind. The sound of boots is terrible. I still have them in my ears. The sound of boots. German military boots on Parisian pavement. The sound of occupation. For 4 years, that sound has meant fear. This German followed me to Saint-Lazare station, crying, telling me he wanted to talk to a woman before dying. He was going to the Russian front. Before dying. Not in case I die. Not if something happens to me. Before dying. As a certainty. He knows he's going to die on the Russian front. Everyone knows. The Eastern Front is a death sentence. He just wants to talk to a woman one last time. To remember what it was like to be human. So, I spoke to him but very badly, because I was very angry against the Germans. I said, "We have nothing to eat. You deprived us of everything." My brother was arrested by the Gestapo. She vents 4 years of rage at him. This crying soldier becomes the target for all her accumulated fury. For the starvation. For her imprisoned brother. For 4 years of occupation. And there he opened his wallet to me, and he gave me all his tickets. And then I left him there, like that. I left him on the sidewalk, crying. She left him crying on the sidewalk. A German soldier about to be sent to his death, crying alone at a Paris train station. And now it haunts my memory because this man surely died immediately, so much he was afraid of dying. And if so, he was very nice. The proof, he wanted to talk to a woman before dying. That's not bad. It haunts her memory. 70 years later, she still thinks about that crying German soldier. Still feels guilty for rejecting him. Still wonders if she was his last human contact before dying in Russia. But what else could she do? He was the enemy. Her brother was in a Gestapo prison. Her family was starving. Why should she comfort him? And yet it haunts her. Because he was also human. Also terrified. Also about to die. There are no good answers here. No right choices. Just impossible situations and the ghosts they leave behind. 1944. France becomes again a theatre of war. The territory is bombarded by Allied aviation with extreme violence. In Normandy, near Évreux, Huguette and Jean-Yves Le Bihan, those who filmed the lines waiting in front of stores, escaped death several times. Incredible fear. A bombing is terrible. Afterwards we said to ourselves, the Americans hit far. They had destroyed a lot of houses in Évreux. There had been a big bombardment. 220 dead. 220 dead. In one bombing raid. In one French city. They did not have a choice. It was necessary to get rid of the Germans. During this period, the Germans became so aggressive, we knew it had to end, even if it means paying the price. Even if it means paying the price. The price is high. Allied bombing of France kills 60,000 French civilians. More than German bombing killed in 1940. More than all the executions by the Germans during 4 years of occupation. To get rid of the Germans, there weren't many solutions. It's certain there are always broken pots in this kind of terrible war. Broken pots. That's one way to describe 60,000 dead civilians. Collateral damage. The price of liberation. The Germans try to take advantage of this. They attend the funerals of bombing victims in compassion. They help dig people out of rubble. They provide medical care. See? The Germans protect you. The Americans kill you. Who is really your enemy? But their propaganda doesn't reach anyone anymore. It doesn't make people forget the atrocities committed by their own troops. The SS now draw on the numbers of the regular army, the Wehrmacht, and carry out fierce repression against the resistance without sparing the populations. One French witness remembers encountering the Waffen-SS. The last German with whom I spoke, he was a Waffen-SS. And naturally, the question he asked me, If I knew where there were terrorists, he didn't call them resistance fighters, of course. You realize? Ask that to a young French girl. The Waffen-SS did not retreat ahead of nothing. Did not retreat ahead of nothing. Meaning, they would do anything. Torture anyone. Kill anyone. Burn any village. To find the resistance. As their defeat looms, the Germans stop filming France. No more amateur movies of French scenery. No more photos with smiling French girls. No more tourist shots of the Eiffel Tower. There are no images of the thousands of Jews who continue to be deported to the east. Very few photos of the hundreds of massacres. Like this one, filmed by a French civilian in Lantilly, Burgundy, a few days before D-Day. A torture post. A mass grave. Bodies in a ditch. Most of the films from the summer of 1944 are shot by French people to testify. To document what the Germans are doing. To preserve evidence. Like here in Dorton, in the Jura, where Raymond Rouleau films a torture post, a mass grave, and the village burned to the ground. The Germans came by road and started to burn and to massacre the populations, to burn villages. The people of the villages had fled into the forest, fearing the Germans, and the Germans organized a raking of the forests. Raking the forests. Combing through the woods systematically. Hunting people like animals. And they considered that all people who were outside the village were resistance fighters, so they deported them. Some were tortured. Finally, it was very bloody. Very bloody. At this moment, we were really afraid of them. They said, "That's not true," but we couldn't understand that we had seen men who were like us, and then afterwards they were savages. Men who were like us became savages. They felt they were going to lose the war, okay, but they were truly savages. What happened? How did the correct Germans of 1940 become the savages of 1944? Maybe they were always savages, just hiding it. Or maybe 4 years of occupation, 4 years of resistance attacks, 4 years of knowing they're losing, 4 years of watching their friends die turned them into savages. Or maybe, and this is the darkest possibility, maybe there's no such thing as men like us and savages. Maybe, given the right circumstances, any of us could become what they became. At that time, we had another idea of the German army. Who was no longer the army superb, well organized? It was a kind of stampede, doubtful, and we were at the same time dismayed to see these people behave like brutes, but at the same time reassured because we said to ourselves, with these people, the army won't go far. From June 6, 1944, date of the Allied landing in Normandy, the balance of power is reversed. And the Germans, under the eyes of the French, begin their retreat. When the front collapsed in Normandy, it happened very quickly. The main units were beaten. It was a terrible escape. Terrible escape. The Germans who marched into France in perfect formation in 1940 are fleeing in chaos in 1944. But we wore this uniform, and deserting meant to be put in front of a wall. Who wanted this? We were given weapons, vehicles, and we were still proud of our unit and our artillery fire. Still proud. Even in defeat. Even while running for their lives. Still proud of being German soldiers. Heinz Heit barely has time to say goodbye to his French friend Viviane, the girl who loved to dance. She was at the window, and I was in the street. She didn't come out. She stayed in the apartment. We just exchanged some sentences. Just some sentences. After years of friendship. After dancing together. After letters exchanged. Just some sentences. She said Denk and Mitch, which I didn't understand at first. It meant in German, think of me, with a French accent. These are the only words in German that she ever told me. Think of me. She learned that phrase in German for him. For this moment, her goodbye. Nothing spectacular then. On the one hand, fear in the back of my neck. On the other side, a beautiful friendship which is coming to an end. We felt as out of place as possible. Out of place. A German soldier and a French girl. Friends during the occupation. What were they thinking? What world did they imagine they were living in? From her window, Huguette Le Bihan films the retreat. I remember Germans who were looking for means of transportation, bicycles even, to go because they were afraid the Americans were arriving. They were afraid. The Germans are afraid of the Americans, the way the French were afraid of the Germans 4 years earlier. The wheel has turned. They left with everything they found as a car, as a bicycle. I even saw a German on horseback, as we see in the film The Longest Day, lamentable. Lamentable. The German army that arrived in Mercedes staff cars is leaving on stolen bicycles. On foot. On horses. With whatever they can find. They took anything to save yourself. They too had their exodus. Their exodus. Just like the French in June 1940. 8 million people on the roads. Now it's the Germans' turn. Fleeing. Terrified. Taking whatever they can carry. One German soldier remembers, during a quarter, I had diarrhea until I can't take it anymore. I was so scared. All these whistles in the air, total American superiority in the sky. We were just saying, how long will it last? Total American superiority in the sky. The Luftwaffe is gone. The skies belong to American and British planes now. Strafing. Bombing. Hunting German columns. The French watch with complicated emotions. We almost went so far as to pity them because we said to ourselves, they have a funny face now. It made quite a difference. We said to ourselves, it happens to you too. It didn't hurt them, apart from pride, and to their dignity of the Great Reich. It happens to you too. 4 years of payback compressed into that single phrase. You made us flee. Now you're fleeing. You made us suffer. Now you're suffering. How does it feel? In Normandy, Huguette and Jean-Yves Le Bihan rush with their camera ahead of the first Americans. I asked them where they were going. They told me they were going towards the east of France, quickly, and there you go. There you go. The story of a people who try to reconnect with their destiny. 4 years of occupation are ending. Is being liberated. Not by French arms, by American ones. But liberated nonetheless. In Paris, without waiting for the Allies, the inhabitants rise up. Among them is a German, Hans Heisel, the one who joined the French Communist Party. We get up in the morning, we go out and see posters everywhere. French people, Parisians, take up arms. Let's free our city. Maybe it was a bit like then of the Great French Revolution. The Great French Revolution. Paris, liberating itself. The people rising up. Barricades in the streets. Just like 1789. Just like 1848. Just like 1871. In the streets there were men, women, children who built barricades. With one of these enthusiasms, no more Germans dared cross the city, but they had tanks everywhere. Barricades against tanks. Enthusiasm against armor. It shouldn't work, but somehow it does. I saw one enter a street, and the locals threw Molotov cocktails from the window and from the roof on the tank until it catches fire. Hans Heisel, German soldier, watching French civilians firebomb a German tank and cheering them on. Because he's chosen his side. And it's not Germany's. The story of a humiliation which, once again, changes sides. One German soldier reflects bitterly, "It was not possible to do a worse exit than this. I felt like a loser. Yes, I lost the war. Me personally, I lost the war by being taken prisoner." Another remembers the German prisoners at Gare du Nord. "I saw some at the Gare du Nord taken out hands on their heads. It was the FFI, the French forces of the interior, who had dislodged them. Hands on head, and everyone spat on them. They were full of spit. It was something horrible. It shocked me terribly. Although they are our enemies, I don't think I would have done that." Full of spit. 4 years of rage expressed in saliva. French crowds spitting on German prisoners. The ultimate degradation. The ultimate revenge. One of these Germans who have just been arrested is Walter Dresner. During months, he photographed France as the Germans fantasized it, apolitical and sensual. His last photos are from July 44 at the Deligny swimming pool with his French girlfriend. Beautiful summer day. Young lovers. The war seems far away. Then, days later, he's arrested. He writes in his diary, "We are pushed by black people of the Leclerc division. A wave of insults rains down on us. Rue de Rivoli, the one who precedes me, receives a punch under the chin and falls. A Frenchman lifts a bicycle and throws it on us, who are defenseless. They take revenge for things many of us are innocent. In Paris, no one would treat an animal like that. In Paris, no one would treat an animal like that. But Walter isn't an animal. He's a German. And right now, in August 1944, that's worse. From the French side, the reaction is cold. Hans Heisel, the German who joined the resistance, "Not for me, they are not comrades. Those who fight for the Nazis are not comrades. Of course you have to take them. And they must be treated like criminals. They are responsible for all this. I can regret that he goes into captivity, but they already have the chance to have their life saved." They already have the chance to have their life saved. Many won't. Summary executions of German prisoners are common, particularly by resistance fighters who have scores to settle, who have seen their friends tortured, their families deported, their villages burned, Another German prisoner reflects, "Yes, it was very humiliating, and besides, it was understandable that we are treated this way. Even if unfairly, it has been said, German people equals Nazis, which wasn't true for the majority. Which wasn't true for the majority. Maybe not. But the majority wore the uniform. The majority followed orders. The majority participated. And now they're paying the price." A French witness captures the emotion perfectly. To see the Germans like that, in discomfiture, I assure you it was truly consoling of many things. Yes, the payback. The payback. But another Frenchman offers a more measured assessment. For us, France in 1945 was not victorious. She was one of the winners because she had put herself on their side. But the war in France, it's the Americans who won it, right? It's the Americans who won it. That's the uncomfortable truth. France didn't liberate itself. France was liberated by Americans, by British, by Canadians. The resistance helped. The Free French forces helped. But France did not win its own freedom. It was given back. And that will shape French identity for generations to come. Enjoy. That of all those who survived miraculously to Nazism. Like the young Leon Sidlaki, the 10-year-old boy protected by the Jacobs, the Protestant couple who had a heart. He survived. Against all odds. Hidden in plain sight in a Parisian alley, while thousands of other Jewish children were rounded up and sent to Auschwitz. Or the Boyer family, these Alsatian Jews who come out of their hiding place to welcome the Allies. With their little girl born under German occupation. Martine, who was filmed as a baby while her parents pretended the Germans weren't there. Who was registered with false papers? Whose birth was announced in newspapers as an act of defiance against fate? She's alive. She made it. Watch the footage of the liberation. These Jewish families emerging from hiding, blinking in the sunlight, hardly believing it's over, that they survived. The joy is real. The relief is overwhelming. But it's a joy tempered by knowledge, by absence, by all the empty spaces where people used to be. For every Leon who survived, there were dozens who didn't. For every Martine, there were countless children who never got to grow up. 75,000 Jews deported from France. Only 2,500 came back. The survivors carry that weight for the rest of their lives. Why me? Why did I live when they died? What am I supposed to do with this gift of survival? In bitterness, also for the French, to have largely been released by others, and failing to have won the war, to have sometimes lost their soul. 4 years after the defeat of 1940, Nazism is defeated and lasting peace will settle between the two countries. But at what cost? France emerges from the war deeply divided, not geographically like Germany, but morally, psychologically. In the months after liberation, the purge begins. The epuration. Collaborators are arrested, tried, executed. sometimes legally, sometimes not. Women who had relationships with Germans have their heads shaved in public squares, paraded through the streets, humiliated, beaten. Did all of them deserve it? Some were truly collaborators. Informants, people who betrayed Jews and resistance fighters. But others, women who fell in love, women who needed to feed their children, women who made impossible choices in impossible times. The purge isn't about justice. Not really. It's about catharsis. About punishing someone, anyone, for 4 years of humiliation. And what about the millions who accommodated? Who worked in factories making German uniforms? Who sold food to German soldiers? Who translated for them? Who invited them for coffee? Are they collaborators? Or just people trying to survive? France never really answers that question. Instead, it constructs a myth. The myth of a France that resisted. A nation of resistors. 40 million resistors, as the saying went. Marshal Pétain is written out of the story as an aberration. The Vichy government is treated as illegitimate, as if it never really represented France. The uncomfortable truth that millions of French people supported Pétain, that the Vichy government was popular, that many French police enthusiastically rounded up Jews, is buried. It will take decades for France to confront its own history honestly, to admit the extent of collaboration, to acknowledge French complicity in the Holocaust. President Jacques Chirac will finally do it in 1995, 50 years after liberation, admitting that France bore responsibility for the deportation of French Jews. 50 years to say the truth out loud. Who would have imagined at the time that these chain humiliations, 70 years later, would finally be erased? France and Germany, hereditary enemies for 3 centuries. 3 wars in 70 years. 1870, 1914, 1940. Each more devastating than the last. Each leaving deeper scars. Each making the next war seem inevitable. But after 1945, something changes. Both countries are exhausted. Morally, physically, economically, spiritually. Germany lies in ruins, occupied by 4 powers, split in 2. Its cities bombed to rubble. Its people traumatized. Its leaders hanged at Nuremberg. France is liberated but humiliated. Economically devastated. Politically fragmented. Psychologically scarred. And somehow, impossibly, they decide to try something different. Not revenge. Not another humiliating peace treaty like Versailles. Not another cycle of resentment building to war. Instead, reconciliation. It starts small. The European Coal and Steel Community in 1951. France and Germany pooling their coal and steel production, making war between them economically impossible. Then the European Economic Community. Then the European Union. Then the Euro. Each step binding them closer together. each step making the unthinkable, another Franco-German war, more unthinkable. In 1963, Konrad Adenauer and Charles de Gaulle sign a treaty of friendship. The German Chancellor and the French President, the one who led the resistance from London, shaking hands. In 1984, François Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl stand together at Verdun, holding hands. At Verdun, where 300,000 men died in 1916, where General von Rothkirch fought and then returned with his son in 1940. Two old men holding hands at the grave of millions. Who would have thought it possible in 1944? When French crowds were spitting on German prisoners? When German soldiers were burning French villages? But here's what these private films really tell us. They tell us that even in the worst circumstances, even during occupation and war and genocide, people remained human. Complicated. Contradictory. Capable of both cruelty and kindness. The German soldier who shows pictures of his children and then participates in a massacre. The French woman who smiles at a German soldier one day and hides a Jewish child the next. The customs officer who translates for Germans and secretly films evidence against them. The photographer who develops German photos and duplicates them for the resistance. These aren't contradictions to be resolved. They're the reality of being human in impossible circumstances. We want clear categories. Heroes and villains. Resistors and collaborators. Good and evil. But life under occupation doesn't work that way. Most people aren't heroes or villains. They're just people trying to survive. Making compromises. Drawing lines in different places. Doing things they never imagined they'd do. Some of those things are shameful. Some are brave. Most are somewhere in between. And 70 years later, we sit in judgment from the comfort of peace, from the luxury of hindsight, from the safety of countries that haven't been occupied in our lifetimes. We watch these films and we judge. We think, I would have resisted. I would never have collaborated. I would have hidden Jews. I would have fought. Would we? The honest answer is, we don't know. We can't know. Because we haven't been tested. What these films show us is that ordinary people, people who thought they were good, moral, decent, found themselves making choices they never imagined. Choosing survival over resistance. Choosing their family over strangers. Choosing silence over danger. Were they wrong? Some of them, yes. Absolutely. The militia members who tortured resistance fighters. The French police who rounded up Jewish children. The informants who betrayed their neighbors. But others? The woman who took a German lover to get food for her children? The factory owner who made German uniforms to keep his workers employed? The shopkeeper who sold bread to German soldiers because refusing meant arrest? These are impossible judgments. And maybe that's the point. Maybe some things can't be judged from the outside. Maybe some decisions are so impossible that there are no right answers. What we can say is this. The occupation revealed what people were capable of. The best and the worst. People like the Jacobs, who risked everything to hide a Jewish child. People like Hans Heisel, the German soldier who joined the resistance against his own country. People like Robert Brochot, who duplicated 700 photos at the risk of execution. And people who informed on their neighbours. Who tortured prisoners? Who sent children to death camps? Most people fell somewhere in between, doing a little good, doing a little bad, mostly trying to survive. This is how the war really ends. Not with clear victory, not with justice for everyone who deserved it, but with exhaustion, with relief, with complicated emotions that can't be reduced to triumph or shame. And with it ends an age-old hostility between France and Germany. The enemy next door became, eventually, just the neighbour. Two countries that killed millions of each other's citizens over 3 wars decided, finally, that there had to be a better way. And they found one. Not by forgetting the past, not by pretending it didn't happen, but by remembering it honestly, by confronting it, by choosing, consciously, to build something different. These private films are part of that honest remembering. They show us what occupation really looked like. Not the sanitized version in textbooks, not the heroic myths, but the messy, complicated human reality. Germans who were sometimes kind and sometimes monstrous. French people who sometimes resisted and sometimes collaborated. Everyone trying to navigate impossible situations. Everyone making choices they'd spend the rest of their lives thinking about. 70 years later, most of these people are gone. Janelle, who fled the Germans on the roads in June 1940. Günther Flamm, the young warrant officer who marched through France believing in German superiority. Hans Heisel, the working-class boy from Leverkusen who ended up fighting against his own country. Viviane, who just wanted to dance. But their films remain. Their testimony remains. Their complicated, contradictory, deeply human stories remain. And they ask us a question. Not, what would you have done? That's too easy. Too self-congratulatory. But, what are you doing now? Because the circumstances that create occupation, nationalism, hatred of the other, the dehumanization of enemies, the willingness to sacrifice others for your own security, those circumstances still exist. The choice between resistance and accommodation still exists. The choice between helping strangers and protecting yourself still exists. The choice between speaking up and staying silent still exists. We're not occupied. We're not at war. We don't face the choices these people faced. But we face our own choices. Every day. About what we're willing to accept. What we're willing to ignore. What we're willing to do when injustice happens to someone else. And these films remind us that history is made by ordinary people, making ordinary choices that add up to something extraordinary, for good or for ill. The French and the Germans made their choices between 1940 and 1944. Some chose resistance. Some chose collaboration. Most chose something in between. And then, after the war, they made another choice. To break the cycle. to try reconciliation instead of revenge, to build peace instead of planning the next war. That choice, that conscious decision to do something different, is perhaps the most important lesson of all. Because it tells us that we're not condemned to repeat history, that enemies can become neighbors, that reconciliation is possible, that even after the worst atrocities, even after genocide and occupation and war, peace can be built. But it has to be built consciously, intentionally, with effort and honesty and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The enemy next door became just the neighbor. But not by accident, not by forgetting, by remembering honestly and choosing differently. That is the legacy of these private films. That is what the crossed gaze of French and Germans across 4 years of occupation teaches us. Not that war is inevitable. Not that occupation reveals who people really are. Not that there are clear heroes and villains. But that people are complicated. That history is made by human choices. And that those choices matter. Every single one of them,